leave him alone and vulnerable to the enemy's attack on his sexuality. Pornography and masturbation becomes an escape for far too many young boys. A young boy learns that whenever he is lonely or hurting, he can medicate by looking at pornography or indulging in masturbation. Many men have reported to me that by the time they were 16 or 17 years old, they were already masturbating 10 to 20 and even more times every week. Think about it. They were addicted to sex before they were even old enough to vote, purchase alcohol, or even their own porn. Now, the thing that's hard for some people to understand is that many of these young men deeply love God. Unfortunately, when a young man knows it's wrong, that knowledge actually adds to his shame and his desire to stop the sin. And when he can't stop it, he's often left with only one alternative, and that's to hide it. After all, in his mind, he asks the question, what would people think if they knew what I did? And tragically, the hiding of the sin is one of Satan's primary tools leading to compulsion and bondage. Many of us thought that getting married would solve the problem. After all, once we can have legitimate God-honoring sex, surely the pull of pornography will fade away. What they don't realize, however, is that for them, sex has become their drug of choice. Remember what I said earlier about the dopamine and other chemicals that the body releases at the point of sexual climax? Again, we can think of those chemicals as, quote, brain candy. And individuals condition their bodies to expect and even demand a daily flood of the candy. Well, guess what? Real women, real wives have headaches, monthly cycles, and just flat out sometimes don't want to be in the same room with us, let alone physically intimate. And so the struggle continues, and in many ways grows worse. I know it grew worse in my life because of the pain of the relationship and the fear of being found out by the very person whom I cared about the most. The person that I loved the most, the person that I wanted to like me the most, was now living in the house with me, and she had more opportunities every day to discover what a fraud I believed I was. And it became a very terrifying place. Well, guess where we turn when we have learned to use sex as medication? When we're afraid, we turn right back to our old ways. It also grows worse because without understanding it, the wife often feels used and unconnected. She senses his disappointment, his shame, and his despair. And to help us understand this, I want you to imagine this scenario. And again, I'm talking primarily from a male perspective because that's what I know more. But I have talked with a number of women who say that many of these things hold true. Female sexual addiction typically has more of a love addiction aspect than male sexual addiction, but there are still many, many common traits. But again, imagine this scenario. Imagine a boy who discovers masturbation when he is 12 and then grows up and marries when he's 22. That gives him 10 years of solo sexual conditioning before he walks into the hotel room on his honeymoon as a, quote, technical virgin. However, think of the elaborate strategy Satan has used to build a wall between he and his wife. You see, I believe God designed the wedding night to be a powerful time of physical intimacy, celebrating the emotional and relational connection of man and woman as they were created to come together. Yet for many, it's painfully disappointing. Not disappointing because there's something wrong with his wife. No, the problem is him. Think about it. It's basic conditioning. Okay? You remember Pavlov's dog from your Psych 101 class? Remember, every day they rang the bell and gave him his food. And after a while, they observed that simply ringing the bell would start the dog salivating. They didn't have to bring any food out. He didn't have to see it or smell it or anything. He heard the bell and he knew it was time to eat. Ring the bell, feed the dog. Unfortunately, many men condition themselves in a similar way for shame. You see, a common problem is that for an average of at least 5 times a week, for 10 years, a young man goes through a cycle where sexual energy and excitement builds up to a crescendo and then reaches its climax at orgasm. However, instead of having a wife to bond to unite with as God designed, he instead finds himself all alone. And so the instant he releases, Satan comes in with a flood of guilt and shame for the sin of lust and gratification. So just do the math. And again, these numbers are very conservative. Again, imagine that they reflect the story of a man who discovers masturbation at 12 and marries when he's 22. 5 times per week equals 260 times a year. 260 times a year for 10 years equals 2,600 solo sexual experiences, each leading not to a joyful connection with another person, but to the isolation of shame. 2,600 solo sexual experiences of climbing the mountain of sexual excitement and pleasure only to crash down to the isolation of shame. Well, guess what comes rushing in on a man who has been trapped in this cycle on his wedding night? Again, ring the bell, feed the dog. There's no reason for him to be in shame, yet he feels the shame. Well, guess what comes rushing in on him for many, many years in his marriage? Why? Because he's trained himself to go through this cycle. So now, even though he is legitimately with his wife, he still emotionally falls off the cliff into shame because he's burned a pathway into his brain through repetitive orgasm-centered sexuality. And he has no clue why he feels badly, and his wife has even less. The only thing she knows is that sex becomes more and more difficult and emotionally painful because somewhere deep within her gut, she knows that sex is about relationship and connection. She often feels rejected, used, and ultimately alone. In order to survive, she may begin to pull away emotionally, physically, and sexually. And naturally, he interprets her pulling away as rejection. Well, guess where he turns when he feels the pain of her rejection? Same place he's always turned for pain relief. The medication of sexual fantasy and acting out. And this downward spiral leads a man into incredible bondage. And so now I ask the question again. Do you see more of why God intends for sex to be in marriage? And if you can, then you're ready for the next crucial point. And that is that masturbation feeds isolation. How sad is it that this is a reality for many? Some are single because through pornography and masturbation, they have learned they can have a false intimacy without risking relationship. Many married individuals live relationally isolated in part because their addiction to, quote, solo sex has isolated them even from the one they promised to love, honor, and cherish. More than one individual has told me about fantasizing about his wife being killed and thinking he would be better off because he got more enjoyment out of masturbation than he did sex anyway. Okay? Thankfully, those have been confessions of recognizing what an ugly, horrible place Satan had led them to. But in their thinking, it was, well, if my wife's gone, then he could take care of himself without all the conflict and frustration of the relationship. Why? Because masturbation feeds isolation. Okay, that's the heavy stuff. The good news is there's hope. There is tremendous hope. And the good news is that God wants to restore our sexuality, heal our brains, and maybe, just maybe, Romans 12:2 is even more literal than we realize. Romans 12:2 says this, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Well, the question I want to ask you this morning is, what if this verse speaks literally about our physical brains? I think that maybe it does. And to help you visualize that possibility, I want you to look closely at a couple slides of individuals who are in recovery from their addictions and notice the change. Okay, here's what the bottom of a particular brain looked like before quitting drugs and alcohol. And here is that same brain after just 1 year of sobriety. You see the difference? You see how the holes and gaps are beginning to fill in? Do you see the restorative effect of 1 year of sobriety? And just a side note here, folks, I think there's more going on than sobriety here. Okay? Sobriety and recovery are not always equal. Sobriety is a step on the road to recovery, but it is not equal to recovery. Okay? But notice the changes that are taking place after 1 year of sobriety. Here's the top view of the same brain. Isn't it amazing that God created our brains with the ability to literally come back to life? 1 year of sobriety, and yes, there are still parts that aren't working perfectly, but look, they are beginning to work again. But at this point, I think it's critical to remind ourselves of something Dr. Jim Wilder says in his restarting video. And that is that he says, you must work as hard on your recovery as you did on your addiction. It doesn't come easy, but it can come. But here is the good news. If you stop acting out, and this goes for, I think, all addictions, because they all have similar effects. If you stop acting out and start doing your recovery, you will begin to experience a genuine transformation of your mind. And so the question we need to all ask ourselves is, which brain do I want? You see, holiness is good in many things, but not in a SPECT scan of my physical brain. And I can tell you firsthand that recovering from a sexual addiction has changed my life so completely that I have no doubt that you could have done before and after SPECT scans of my brain, and you would see very similar results. Now, what you need to understand about me is I never did drugs or alcohol. Other than my addiction to pornography and masturbation, my only addictions were soda, ice cream, and being a really good Pharisee. And that's maybe the worst addiction of all, I'll say. But I can tell you firsthand, my sexual addiction was eating me alive from the inside out. And my brain did not function properly. And that came out primarily in my relationships. You see, like many, I was introduced to pornography when I was about 11 years old. And from the time I was 14 until I was 34, I rarely went more than 24 hours without a sexual release. And I spent countless hours in the pig pen of pornography. However, the grace of God led me out of my addiction 10 years ago. And now when I read things about the effects of non-functioning parts of the brain, I can see my old self in the descriptions. But praise be to God, however, I can also see evidence of great healing. I haven't arrived, and my healing will not be fully complete this side of heaven. However, I can stand before you this morning as one who has personally experienced God's substantial healing in my life. And I can tell you firsthand that there is no comparison between life on this side of the addiction and life in the addiction. It is night and day. So what can you do to change it? What can you do to transform your brain? What can you do to allow God to heal your brain? What can you do to make long and lasting change if you've damaged your brain through sex and other addictions? Well, let me give you several things. First of all, it's helpful to understand the right and left functions of the brain. And what you need to see here is that the brain is split into two sides. Okay, you've probably heard of right-brained and left-brained people, artists and engineers. Okay, that's an oversimplification, though it does have some validity. The reality is we all use both sides of our brain, just not nearly as well as we think we do. Okay? And the first thing you need to understand about the left-right split of your brain is that the left side of your brain is the file cabinet. It contains everything you know verbally and logically. Okay, the left side of your brain, for example, has a file folder for everything you know about anything from a verbal perspective. For example, you have a folder in that cabinet that says dogs. And in that folder is everything you ever heard or read about dogs. You know the names of many different kind of breeds. You know the brand of dog food your wife tells you to buy, etc., etc. All verbal and logical. When you think of the right side of your brain, think experience. And the right side of your brain remembers everything you have ever experienced in your life, pre-birth till now. It is nonverbal, image-based, and focused on voice tones rather than verbal content. Therefore, while your left side has neat file folders for information, your right side has 3D holographic movies and high-tech Dolby sound, complete with emotions, feelings, touch, and even odors. Okay? It's why people can have such a different response when I say the word dog. For example, if you grew up with your dog sleeping with you at night and being your best friend, you hear the word dog and you have a positive physical and even emotional response. If, however, you were attacked by a pit bull when you were 3 and nearly mauled to death, you hear the word dog and a wave of uncontrollable fear flashes through your entire body that no amount of information is going to change. Okay? The right side of your brain is also the executive control system for your brain. It is in charge. That's why someone who's been attacked by a pit bull as a child can read all the information in the world about the positive effects of having a dog for a pet and still be terrified when they hear a dog bark. You see, they can't overcome their fear through logical verbal information, but only by healing the past trauma and having new and positive experiences with friendly dogs. It's also important to note that the right side of the brain has a 4-level hierarchical structure that we will look at in a moment. And it is also dominant for emotions in the body. It synchronizes, notices, and remembers everything. That's why sometimes people can have body memories for things they can't consciously remember, yet almost feel. And then finally, the right hemisphere decides when the left side can change its beliefs. So no amount of, quote, information in and of itself will make a difference until the right side is disturbed enough to tell the left side of your brain, you know, your conclusion's not working for me over here. It doesn't make any sense. You're going to have to come up with a different explanation. And now what I want you to see from the following slides is that our brain works on a 5-level hierarchical structure. And by 5 levels, I didn't just totally change here. The first 4 are the right side. And then level 5 is the left side of your brain. Just give you an advance warning. But what you need to know about this is that nothing gets to level 5 without first passing through levels 1 through 4. So if there's problems at a foundational level, it doesn't matter what's in the upper levels. You're not able to act like yourself or function properly. Okay, level 1 is the attachment center. And this is the very core base of the brain upon which everything else builds. And this begins with the connection we had first with our mother and then our father in our early childhood. If this attachment is strong and secure, then we have a solid foundation for life. However, if our family of origin was not healthy, and especially if we did not bond well, we will struggle with attachment pain, which is the deep ache in our soul we just can't quite put our finger on. And the reason we can't put our finger on it is because it's subcortical, which means it's deeper in our brain than our conscious awareness. This pain, however, is the most excruciating pain known to man, and we do all sorts of things to numb it.